Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you to our When Ransomware Attacks Summit, brought to you by Carahsoft, Ignite, Metallic, and Zoho. The editorial staff of Virtualization and Cloud Review and RenmanMag.com have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on the topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You will receive an email with the replay when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you. During today's third session, we will be giving away Oculus Quest 2 virtual reality headset, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from Carahsoft, Ignite, Metallic, and Zoho available on the console right now, so please download and check these out. It's because of our sponsors' underwriting of this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for their support and ask you to check out these resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to our first session of today's summit, Current Ransomware Attacks and Strategies. This session features Alan Liska, Intelligence Analyst at Recorded Future. Alan has 20 years of experience in ransomware and information security. Liska has provided ransomware-related counsel and key recommendations to major global corporations and government agencies, and sits on National Ransomware Task Force and speaks at global conferences around the world. Take it away, Alan.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for your time today. Really appreciate everybody joining us and look forward to the conversation. It's always really good, and there are always a lot of great questions. So I want to start with some numbers just to kind of set a baseline of what we're looking at right now. So far in 2022, we've seen more than 900 victims posted to ransomware extortion sites. Victims posted to ransomware extortion sites only account for about 10 to 15% of total number of victims. So already in 2022, we're in the likely thousands, if not tens of thousands, of ransomware victims. And you can see in the bottom of this chart that the number of victims has been fairly consistent. There was a little bit of dip at the end of December and in the beginning of January. That is a normal dip. A lot of the ransomware actors just don't do any activity over the kind of winter holidays. And then there was some disruption in ransomware activity to coincide with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but things have ticked right back up. I also want to highlight that we've seen 25 law enforcement actions in the last 12 months against ransomware actors. That's a combination of arrests, sanctions, straight up attacking ransomware infrastructure, and even clawing back Bitcoin payments, so taking the money back from the ransomware actors. So we're seeing more law enforcement action than ever before, up to and including we've seen attacks. We've seen law enforcement action in Russia. So in January, Russia arrested 17 members of REvil. Now that was very short-lived. We have confirmation that all but two of them we have confirmation that most of them have been released. There are two that we don't have confirmation as whether or not they've been released, but still, it was a surprising turn. Not something we would normally see. So even if it was short-lived, it was just an interesting data point. And we're not just seeing indictments of ransomware actors, we're actually seeing extradition and trials. So there are currently 2 trials going on right now with one of the members of REvil, so a REvil affiliate, not one of the core members, is currently undergoing trial, and then a one of the main operators of the NetWalker ransomware, is also in trial. And you can see that, unfortunately, this extradition process takes a while. So while the indictment was handed down in January of 2021, the trial didn't begin until March of 2022, and that trial will go on for a while. So unfortunately, while law enforcement is moving, law enforcement does move a lot slower, which is which can be frustrating with so many attacks going on and so many victims. But the fact that we are seeing so much law enforcement activity right now is really good, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. We also had the big news in January, and that when Russia invaded Ukraine, Conti was one of the ransomware groups that offered full-throated support of Russia. Unfortunately for Conti, a lot of its affiliates are in countries outside of Russia. They didn't like that, and there was a Ukrainian researcher who had managed to gain access and dumped everything, all of their chats, all of their documentation, and so on. That's provided a sort of a bevy of research for analysts and for security teams to understand more about how Conti works, how they recruit, how they were set up, how they were structured. One of the things that was leaked was the Conti source code. So in the last year, we've had the source code from Conti leaked. We've also had source code from Revil that we think was shared widely in underground forums. And that's led to a splintering of ransomware groups. So this time last year, we probably had a couple of dozen different ransomware groups that we were tracking. And just in the last 6 months, there have been 60 new variants. A lot of them are based on Revil and Conti source code, excuse me, which, as you can imagine, is a problem because now that's a lot more different groups to keep track of. And try and figure out and understand what they're doing, how they're working, et cetera. Now, that being said, a lot of these groups, even though they may be using they're not part of the main groups, they are still using a lot of the same tactics and techniques, which means it is still possible to detect and stop them. We're also seeing ransomware spread out and become much more global. So we're used to talking about Russia as sort of the nexus for ransomware. And for cybercriminal ransomware, that is still the case. But we are seeing more ransomware operate out of Iran, out of China, and even out of Brazil. And we're seeing a bit of a hybrid. So whereas most Russian ransomware activity is entirely cybercriminal focused, so it's entirely financially motivated, there does seem to be a mixture coming out of Iran and China of what appear to be state-backed ransomware operators that are more interested in targeting perceived enemies in the state. So, for example, the Cold Lock ransomware was heavily deployed in Taiwan and other places and against targets that China has a vested interest in. And with the Cold Lock ransomware, for example, there was no way to actually pay the ransom. So it really was intended as a disruptive attack, not so much a way to make money. Iran, the same thing. We've seen a combination of financially motivated ransomware, but others that seem to be working at the direction of the state. At least their targets align directly with Iran's interests. So going after targets in Israel, going after oil and gas targets, et cetera. So it's really, keep an eye on this as a development, something that we expect to see more of this year. And, hopefully we'll understand more how this is kind of falling out in the next few months. This meme is entirely for people over 40. Anybody under 40 probably doesn't get it, but we do need to, just the fact that ransomware has gotten better. It's gotten better, it's gotten faster, and it's gotten stronger. And I've used this chart before, and we're going to kind of break it down, so I'm not going to spend too much on this slide specifically. But this is what a modern ransomware attack looks like, which is one of the reasons why ransomware is so hard to defend. You have a lot of different ways for the ransomware actors to gain initial access, and a lot of different ways for them to move around the network once they're in, a lot of ways for them to steal files and exfiltrate data out of the network, and then a few different ways for them to deploy the ransomware, and then an awful lot of ways for them to engage in extortion activity. So what I like to tell people, and what I really want people to start thinking about when you're thinking about how to defend against ransomware, you want to think of it a little bit like a boxing match, with each one of these being a different round. It's okay if you don't win round 1 or round 2, as long as you get that TKO in round 3 or round 4, and don't let it go all the way to the end, obviously. And that's really how you have to think about it, because there are so many different areas where the ransomware actor can get in that some of your defenses may miss. That as long as you have a layered defense, you have a much better chance of actually stopping a ransomware actor before they can do serious damage to your network. And I want to start with initial access, because that's really where a lot of organizations kind of fall down, is not understanding all of the different ways that ransomware actors can gain access. So we start with phishing. Phishing is still very popular, especially by the larger ransomware groups, but it is actually less common now than some of the other types of attacks. And the reason for that is that renting phishing infrastructure is actually fairly expensive compared to credential stuffing or even exploitation as an attack method. So while Conti, Lockbit, and some of the other big ransomware groups still rely heavily on phishing, it's still not as common as it was, as it was even a few years ago. So, and the usual caveats apply here with phishing, that the best way to defend against phishing is good email security first, and then also phishing awareness training. It's always better if the phishing email never gets to the employee. Whatever you can do to stop that, that's a better way to go. And I do want to emphasize that we have to expand how we think of phishing attacks, because the ransomware groups that are engaging in phishing have gotten a lot more sophisticated. So phishing isn't always an email attack. We do see some ransomware groups now using SMS as the initial attack vector, with a link in the SMS to click on, knowing that that will often bypass email security protocols and corporate firewalls, etc. So you have to really expand that definition and watch for those attack types that these ransomware actors are using. What we think right now is the most common method of initial access for ransomware groups is credential stuffing or credential reuse attacks. And simply because it's easy, and there are a lot of different what we call initial access brokers that are engaged in these kind of attacks. So there's a very low barrier to entry for credential stuffing and credential reuse attacks. There are literally billions of credentials, stolen credentials available on underground markets, and oftentimes for free. If not for free, really, really cheap. So there's this cottage industry that's sprung up to support ransomware groups, what we call initial access brokers. And what they do is the initial access brokers are often newer cyber criminals, younger cyber criminals that are looking to get into the game, but they're not ready to carry out full-on ransomware attacks yet. So they get their start by scanning the internet looking for exposed systems, and then finding credentials that they can use to log into those exposed systems. They put a small implant on there, and then they turn around and sell that access for a couple of $1,000s. So that's literally what they do, is they spend 8 hours a day scanning the internet, looking for vulnerable systems, plugging in credentials, and then selling those systems to the actual people who will carry out the ransomware attack. Think of it like the worst house flipping show ever. But and that's basically what it is. And there are hundreds of these initial access brokers trying to take advantage of all of the systems that are connected to the internet that maybe shouldn't be. I've heard horror stories, unfortunately, of people temporarily enabling access to a server, and having it open for less than 48 hours and having that server compromised because there's so many people conducting these scanning attacks right now. So you really have to be careful with anything that you have exposed to the internet, and you should be monitoring for exposed credentials. So using a service like Have I Been Pwned or something like that, that's going to help you monitor for exposed credentials in the underground market. But then also couple that with multi-factor authentication. So anything that's exposed to the internet should have multi-factor authentication enabled. We also saw a big jump in third-party ransomware attacks last year. And what a third-party ransomware attack is, ransomware actors are getting smarter about their victims. So oftentimes they will land in a victim, and they'll look and they'll see that that victim has access to a number of other companies, often direct access. Rather than deploy the ransomware in that victim, they will use that access, that trusted access, to jump into these other networks. The most well-known example of that is Kaseya last year, but we see MSPs in particular being constantly used by ransomware actors in order to gain access to other networks. So that is a really big problem, and especially because a lot of smaller and medium-sized customers rely heavily on their MSPs for all of their security and IT needs. So they don't really have a way of basically watching the watcher. They don't have a way of detecting, hey, my MSP is doing things it shouldn't be doing, until unfortunately it's too late. So third-party ransomware attacks are a huge problem, and we live in such an interconnected world where so many different networks connect to other networks that, again, this is a problem that is only going to continue to grow as we, as ransomware actors get better than this. So it's really important to understand both what your vendors have set up as a security plan to prevent ransomware attacks. So it's not enough for you to have your own plan for preventing a ransomware attack. You need to know, and you need to have regular conversations with all of your vendors, if they're connected into your network especially, what their plans and what their contingencies are for ransomware attacks, to make sure that that's acceptable and you think that your data and that your network is going to be safe. Exploitation is another one that we're seeing, and again, a lot of this is tied to the initial access brokers. So in 2021, we saw that initial access brokers used 52 different vulnerabilities to gain initial access. So again, it's really easy once you get a vulnerability to just scan the internet looking for systems that are exploitable, that have that vulnerability, and then they will go ahead and exploit it. We especially see things like VPN concentrators being targeted. Some of the lower end firewalls are heavily targeted, and then again, anything that touches the internet. So if you can't force a login to Citrix, if you can exploit it, that's just as good. So keep that in mind. The other thing that we are seeing is, because some of these ransomware operators have a lot of money, the number that I saw is more than $1.5 billion were paid in ransoms last year, and that's probably an undercount. Some of them are actively going after 0 days. So again, that was an example with Kaseya. And what the ransomware actors are specifically looking for, going back to the previous point about third-party attacks, is the ransomware actors are looking for vulnerabilities in tools that are used by MSPs. And the reason for that is, maybe a vulnerability against Microsoft Exchange would be really cool, and you might be able to get a lot of victims, but that's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. Whereas the remote management and monitoring tools used by a lot of MSPs, they're very niche tools, but they're the right kind of target for you as a ransomware actor. So for $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, if you can pay for a 0 day, a previously undisclosed vulnerability for one of those tools, it's going to be cheaper, but it's also going to be a lot more effective and get you into a lot more victims than, again, say, a Microsoft Exchange vulnerability. So you get much more bang for your buck. And with the average ransom being, depending on who you talk to and whose data you're looking at, somewhere from the mid to high six figures, a $20,000 investment could return multifold in terms of the number of victims and the number of ransom that pays out. Which is why, again, anything exposed to the internet should be prioritized for patching. I know that's a really boring piece of advice that everybody has been giving for, the last 20-some years, but it's still really salient to know, hey, what do we have connected to the internet, and make sure you're prioritizing patching those systems. Really, really important. And unfortunately, likely I will be saying this 20 years from now. I'll be sitting in the old folks' home just mumbling that under my breath. Please patch anything connected to the internet, because it is going to be important for, I think, a very long time. A new one that we're seeing this year is both Lapsus and Lockbit are looking to recruit insiders to deploy their ransomware. So, they're having trouble with some of the bigger companies. They can't get access. They've built up a lot of really good security. The companies have, and so now they're looking to just straight up pay somebody to click on a link, download the ransomware, whatever it is. We saw this with Tesla last year, where they were going to offer a Tesla employee $1 million. Fortunately, that employee called the FBI. Right now, they suck at this. We don't have any indicators that they've been able to successfully recruit anybody to be part of that insider threat. But the fact that they're thinking about it and they're trying it means that you should be thinking about it and thinking about how you would address insider threats from ransomware actors now, before they actually figure out how to do it well and start being successful at it. This is your chance to kind of get ahead of a new type of initial access and maybe think about it before it becomes a problem. 5 years ago, ransomware actors sucked at big game hunting. They sucked at moving around networks and finding access and so on. Now they're all pros at it. And so, 5 years from now, they may be really good at this insider threat. So this is one of those few opportunities where instead of being reactive to a ransomware attack, you can be proactive to a potential come-up and figure out how to stop it in place. So again, when we move from initial access to the reconnaissance phase and lateral movement, we see the ransomware groups using the same tools. So Cobalt Strike is used repeatedly, Bloodhound, PowerSploit, AdFind, WMIC, and so on. The same tools are being used over and over again by different ransomware groups. And a lot of that is, ransomware actor starts in one ransomware group, figures out all the tools, gets all the information from them, eventually moves to another ransomware group, takes that knowledge with them, and, trains the other affiliates there, and so that gets spread down. This is where threat hunting becomes really important. So you want to be able to detect these tools in use on your network especially Cobalt Strike and PSExec. Those are sort of the two most common ways that these tools are executed, or that these commands are executed. So you really want to be able to detect those, and Cobalt Strike in particular, you want to be able to detect in memory. So this is where a good EDR solution comes in handy. So like a Sentinel-1 or a Carbon Black or something like that help you detect these tools, and you can be very granular in what you're looking for. So not just looking for PSExec, but looking for PSExec running certain commands. Not just looking for Cobalt Strike, but Cobalt Strike being executed in memory and running. Now, it's not just enough to install EDR and forget about it. You have to constantly fine-tune, and that's part of that threat hunting process. As ransomware groups figure out new ways and new methodologies for using these tools, you want to make sure you're keeping up so that that detection stays current with how the ransomware actors are operating. And again, that's where your EDR becomes really important. You can test out, try new YARA rules, try new signal rules that will detect different techniques that these ransomware actors are using. Refine them in your network to make sure you're not generating too many false positives, and then to make that part of your normal security routine. EDRs are amazing tools. They can be really powerful, but they take a lot of work to keep up and running. And so we really, it's again not enough to just keep operating with the as is with your EDR. You really want to continue that operation and continue to improve and continue to make it better, and stronger. You want your detection to be there. And looking for all of these different tools is part of that strategy. So sort of that, going back to the boxing analogy, part of those different rounds. You want to look for Cobalt Strike and PSExec, but looking for these other tools can detect something that maybe you may have missed. Maybe they have a new technique for using Cobalt Strike, but when they start running Lazan or Bloodhound in the network, you can detect that. And especially for anything that is being used against your domain controller, because every ransomware attack I've ever seen, they are targeting the domain controller. So kind of, protecting your chin in boxing, think of your domain controller as your chin. And I know I'm really stretching that boxing analogy, but I like it, so I'm going to do that. You can't stop me. You really want to protect that domain controller, and you want to have extra guards and extra protections around there. And I also want to emphasize, you'll see the list during reconnaissance and lateral movement of all of the different types of servers that ransomware groups are targeting. Almost every major ransomware group now has a variant that goes after ESXi servers and goes after Linux servers. ESXi in particular in VMware is really popular with ransomware groups because they know if they can just encrypt a bunch of those ESXi servers, they can do a whole bunch of damage to your network really, really quickly. And some of the ransomware groups that we see, they have built encryptors that can take on ESXi servers and shut down and encrypt all of the VMs. What they can't do is they can't actually unencrypt it. I've seen a number of the ESXi variants fail on decryption. So even if you pay the ransom, even if they intend for you to be able to decrypt them, you may not be able to. And a lot of that has to do with file size. I know you'll find this hard to believe, but ransomware actors are good at writing ransomware. They're not as good at writing the decryptors, and so some of the decryptors will choke on files that are bigger than 4 gigs, which a lot of virtual images are. And even if they are able to recover, sometimes there'll be damage to the images because they shut them down improperly, and so the image gets corrupted. So one, make sure you're backing up all of your images and keeping offline backups of your images so that you can restore if there is a problem. broadly speaking, if there's a problem, but in particular with ransomware, because if they are encrypted, you may not be able to recover even if you have a decryption key. The other thing that I want to talk about is these tools down here in blue. Ransomware actors do not like to use the command line to move from network to network. Excuse me, they use a lot of different GUIs. Screen Connect is really popular right now, but I've seen TeamViewer, Splashtop, Altera, AnyDesk, etc. If you are not using those in your network, look for those hashes. They're using the standard off-the-shelf versions of these. So those file hashes are readily available, and you should be looking for remnants of those file hashes in your network. So what will happen is they get in with the loader, they'll deploy whatever initial tools they're going to deploy, and then whatever their preferred desktop GUI of choice is, they will grab that and they will go ahead and send a call back to themselves and start working the reconnaissance and lateral movement. And so, again, if you're not using any of these in your network, look for those hashes, alert on those hashes. If it's not ransomware actors, it's some other kind of malicious activity. Jumping to exfiltration on this screen, a lot of ransomware actors have kind of defaulted to mega.nz. That's New Zealand mega.nz as the upload service of choice because it's fast. There's a lot of tools that make it fairly easy to use. You don't have to compromise another server. You don't have to deal with redirects and so on. So what they will often do when they're stealing data from your network is they will exfiltrate that out to mega.nz. If you don't have a reason for using mega.nz in your network, I highly recommend just blocking not just mega.nz, but all of its associated domains. There are 5 or 6 different domains associated with mega.nz. Just go ahead and block all of them. That will not stop the ransomware actor from exfiltrating data, because if they can't exfiltrate it to mega.nz, they will go ahead and provision a server. They will steal, compromise another server, and they'll upload the data anyway. But what it does do is it creates a warning to you. If you've blocked that activity and don't have legitimate business use for it, and you suddenly, especially at 2 o'clock in the morning, see an attempt to connect to mega.nz, you can go ahead and say, that is probably a ransomware attack, and you can set that as a high priority alert that there was a DNS query to mega.nz and start your investigation immediately, so you may be able to stop that exfiltration of data. So again, not all of them have switched to mega.nz, but more and more of them are, just because it's an ease of use thing. And, ransomware actors, like most of us, are fairly lazy, and so they're going to use what works until it stops working. And so for your organization, if you can make it stop working for them, you may have an advantage. We're also seeing an increase in the types of extortion that ransomware actors are engaged in. So while a lot of the hands-on keyboard part of the attack has remained relatively stable, we've really seen an explosion in the extortion ecosystem over the last couple years, with ransomware groups getting more brazen and more bold in trying to figure out ways to extort money from victims who don't want to pay to recover their files because they have good backups or whatever. And in fact, we're seeing some groups like Lapsus and some of the others that don't engage in encryption at all and just concentrate on the exfiltration and the and the other types of extortion. Because it's easier. You get in, you steal the data, you get back out, and it's faster, and you can still be profitable. You can still coerce an organization into paying hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in ransom. So when we look at those, when we look at how that extortion system has expanded over the last couple of years, we've gone from simply encrypting files and demanding ransom to adding in sensitive files, and now we've moved on to we see ransomware actors threatening DDoS attacks, and in fact carrying out DDoS attacks if a victim doesn't pay. So they'll during the negotiation they'll say no, we're not going to pay, and so they will go ahead and launch a DDoS attack against the organization. We actually have seen, as sort of a separate attack model, we've actually seen some groups who focus on, and it's a different set of groups. It's not these cyber criminals. It's a different set than what we normally think of as a ransomware actor that focus on what we call ransom DOS, where they will start DDoSing a target and not stop until a ransom is paid. So last year in particular, a number of VoIP providers were taken offline by these DOS attacks. So the ransomware actors figured out that if you targeted a SIP server, which does the conversion from like cell phone to network traffic, or cell to network traffic, and landline to network traffic, and so on. If you target the SIP server, that usually didn't have DDoS protection, and so they could target that and basically render a VoIP provider useless, and they could keep that attack up for days or weeks until a ransom is paid. But that's a separate set of actors. We are seeing regular DDoS as part of the operation model. Another thing we're seeing is an authentic media amplification. So, for example, we saw this with the ransomware attack against the NRA last year, where the group behind it, Evil Corp, paid basically paid a Twitter bot farm to retweet all of the stories about this attack, to make it seem bigger and more impactful than it was, in an effort to get the NRA to pay the ransom. We're also seeing personal attacks from some of the ransomware groups. They have, they'll start digging up information on various members of the company or the victim and engage in direct personal attacks against leadership of that organization. So they'll send threatening emails directly to the CEO, threatening to release kind of sensitive information about the CEO or the COO or something like that. Just really kind of getting down and dirty and very adversarial. We see ransomware actors reaching out beyond the company to its clients and partners, and letting them, as many as possible, know about the ransomware attack. So that's become a much more common tactic. In fact, we'll see them rent space in a call center to start calling clients or start calling partners and letting them know that they've been part of a ransomware attack. We saw this with a school district in Texas last year, where the ransomware actor mailed all of the parents, said, "Hey, we have your kid's sensitive information, and we're going to publish that because your school refuses to pay the ransom." We do see, if you have cyber insurance, we do see ransomware actors looking for your cyber insurance policy. So part of what we saw in the Conti leaks were keywords that that Conti recommended searching for when you're looking for files on the network, and a lot of those related to cyber insurance. So you look for cyber, you look for insurance, you look for policy, cyber insurance, all of those at once. So there were a number of keywords they'd given to their affiliates to look for when it comes to cyber insurance and trying to pull information about the cyber insurance policy, and they will use that as a negotiating tool. again, I've seen chats where the where the victim, where the ransomware actor will come back and say, well, it says here that you have $1 million in insurance, so that is your ransom payment now. So keep any documentation around your cyber insurance policy offline. Don't make it easily network accessible. Some of the other things that some ransomware actors have been somewhat successful at, but generally not really, threatening to go to a stock exchange, so for publicly traded companies, threatening to go to the stock exchange and report them. This is going to be important going forward because SEC is considered in the U.S. The SEC is considering putting in requirements that publicly traded companies should have to report ransomware attacks, especially if a ransom was paid. So this is kind of the ransomware actors getting ahead of themselves. But as these kind of regulations around reporting become codified into law or into broadly into regulations, the ransomware actors will try and take advantage of that for people that don't necessarily want to say that they were hit with a ransomware attack. We have seen ransomware actors targeting organizations involved in M&A activity, especially if you are the company being acquired. If they can hit you during that period, then they feel like they have leverage to go to the acquiring company and say, hey, they've been hit with a ransomware attack. All their stuff is encrypted. You should call off the merger. And there's enough M&A activity right now that that is a big concern, or should be a big concern, because it is something that the ransomware actors are actively looking into. We've also seen ransomware actors, again, when we talk about the personal attacks, specifically look for executive endpoints and try to go after those endpoints to steal sensitive files belonging to the executive. So, for example, last year we saw one executive, one of the ransomware groups downloaded a number of compromising photos of the executive's girlfriend and published those as retribution for the organization not paying the ransom. Again, just really looking for any way that they can possibly expose and force payment from the victim organizations. And then finally, a lot of ransomware groups are now actively opposed to bringing in a third-party negotiator or calling in law enforcement when there's a ransomware attack, and they will tell you that if you do that, and they hear that you've done that, they will delete your files, they will delete the key, and you'll have nothing left. Call law enforcement. Don't listen to the ransomware actors. Definitely don't ever take advice on how to respond to a ransomware attack from ransomware actors, because they lie. You want law enforcement involved, especially if you're in over your head. They're going to be able to give you a lot of advice and have a lot of inside information that you likely don't have. And I actually think for many organizations, bringing in a ransomware negotiator, even if you don't intend to pay the ransom, is still a good idea, because they can help you understand the full scope of the situation. They can talk to the ransomware actor on your behalf. They know the questions to ask. At the very least, a ransomware negotiator is an excellent stalling tactic while you're trying to recover and fully assess the damage. The ransomware actor will want you to pay immediately. They will want you to take action immediately. Think of it like a car salesman, a used car salesman, the worst kind of used car salesman. Specifically, like, you've got to buy this car today. I've had 5 other couples looking at it. It's not going to be here if you don't buy it now. The ransomware actors are often the same way. You have 36 hours to pay the ransom, blah, blah, blah. Bringing in a negotiator can help expand that time frame, can help, again, give you a little bit of time to breathe and accurately assess the situation and make the planning. So I do. Companies like GroupSense are really good at kind of giving you that ability to breathe and not have to make immediate and rash decisions. So I want to thank you all for your time today. This is always a really good conversation, and hopefully there's some good questions that we can kind of dive into here. But I really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of the session.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. That was a great talk. I think you gave us a good overview of what today's ransomware landscape looks like. You ready to jump into some user questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Let's kick it off with a two-parter from Kevin. What do you see as the greatest threat for the U.S. in terms of cybersecurity, and how can we educate employees better in our organization?
Yeah, so, it's really interesting. And I think a lot of it depends on your kind of point of view. Ransomware is really disruptive, but I think in terms of stolen money, business email compromise may actually be more profitable for bad guys. And both have the same problem, right? Both have that can have that employee awareness problem. But ransomware, I think, wins out only because you generally see more disruption to an organization when there's a ransomware attack than when there's a business email compromise attack. Yes, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars is bad and sucks, but it doesn't shut down a hospital the way a ransomware attack does. So ransomware is definitely more impactful, but business email compromise may actually be more costly. And both are really challenging to try and stop. Because a lot of times you're relying on security awareness of employees who security is not their main job. So certainly potentially a big problem.
Okay. Here's another good one. Why aren't law enforcement actions having more of an effect on ransomware?
So, a lot of it is that right now we're playing whack-a-mole, right? And so every time you shut down a ransomware actor, another one pops up. And like anything else, if you play whack-a-mole once or twice a year, you're going to be okay at it, but you're not going to be great at it. And for the longest time, that's what was happening. We were playing whack-a-mole once or twice a year with these different ransomware groups. Now it's like we've decided we're going to the ransomware playoffs or whatever. We're going to be, the whack-a-mole playoffs or go pro in whack-a-mole, I guess. There probably is a professional league somewhere of whack-a-mole. And so we're practicing every day. So I think what is happening is we're at that curve of getting really good at figuring out how to take down ransomware infrastructure and how to stop the ransomware actors, even the ones based in Russia. But we're still at the bottom of that curve. If we keep engaging in these 25 police, 30, 40 police actions every year against ransomware groups, we're going to impose costs on ransomware actors that they haven't had before, and that's going to make it more expensive to carry out ransomware attacks. It's just, and I know everybody hates this, it's a matter of being patient. We got to be patient with these ransomware, with law enforcement, and let them go and let them continue to go, improve their capabilities.
Okay, here's another one. How do I ensure that my MSSP is doing everything they claim to be doing?
It's a tough question, especially for non-technical people, right? If I run a real estate office, I don't know how to audit my MSSP. So one of the good news is there's an MSSP association, and I apologize, I should have been prepared with this information. There's an MSSP association that has created a standard checklist. I think if you Google MSSP checklist, you can find it. of questions that you should be asking your MSSP, sort of a basic standards of care to make sure that they can actually answer those questions. So even if you are, running a real estate office or you are a dentist, you can understand, we are meeting this basic standard here, and that should give you a lot more confidence. So I like these kind of standardizations that allow you as maybe not an expert to fully, to be able to double check, your vendors, your partners to make sure they're actually doing what they're doing. I mean, it's what large corporations do. They just have whole teams that are set to compliance and set to check these out. But at least that gives you something that you can use against your vendors.
Okay, here's an actual great question. What would an insider threat ransomware attack look like, and how do you defend against something like that?
So that is a really good question, and we don't know fully yet what those are going to look like because the ransomware actors haven't figured out what they're going to look like yet. As much as they're trying, most likely what it will be is the ransomware actor. One, they're not going to meet you in person, unless you work for a company like Tesla, where they think they're going to get a multi-million-dollar ransom out of it. So it's all going to be conducted over email or over Signal or some sort of communication, Telegram. Likely they will give you a link to download something. So what you'll probably see happen is you'll see an employee that normally doesn't have any network access or try and access anything on the network suddenly probably do some light probing on the network because they're going to have to show proof to the ransomware actor that they work there and that there's enough good information on your network that it's worth the ransomware actor's time. So, and the employee won't know what they're doing, so they're likely going to run some commands based on whatever the ransomware actor tells them to do, and those will be pretty noisy and pretty obvious. And then there'll likely be a link that they click on and download. So, having good monitoring in place, having good filtering against, known bad IP addresses and known bad domains is going to go a long way to do that. And then, any kind of DLP solution that allows you to limit the kind of network activity that your employees engaged in is always going to be good.
Okay, great. It looks like we actually ran through all of our user questions. So thanks again, Alan, for moderating this session, or for hosting this session.
And you said you moderated. You did a great job. Thank you very much.
I'm still a little asleep, apparently.
Well, thank you again. These are always really fantastic events. And again, I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conversations today.
Yeah, for everybody else, please stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Expert Enterprise Ransomware Best Practices. Take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Chaosoft, Ignite, Metallic, and Zoho, and we'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of today's online summit, When Ransomware Attacks. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine and Virtualization and Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsors, Chaosoft, Ignite, Metallic, and Zoho, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends in the Converge 360 group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the second of our 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, a quick reminder that each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It will be coming your way within the next few days. Also, this session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our very best to get to all of them. You might also notice that our sponsors have provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. And oh God, last but not least, During our third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving an Oculus Quest 2 virtual reality headset, but you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our second session, Expert Enterprise Ransomware Best Practices. For this session, we've called on scientist, author, and 20-time Microsoft MVP, Brian Posey. Brian has written thousands of articles about information technology and contributed to dozens of books and video training courses. He writes the popular Posey's Tips and Tricks column for Redmond Magazine, as well as the must-read Posey's Moonshot column about his commercial astronaut training experiences. You are in for a great session. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much, John. So today we're going to be talking all about ransomware best practices. And, during the intro, John mentioned the Q&A at the end, and that's something that we do for all of these sessions that I present. But if I'm going to be totally honest with you, one of the toughest things about doing these sessions is not being able to see or hear the audience and not really knowing if anybody's got any questions in real time. And I kind of hate that, especially for this one, because this is one of those sessions that would really encourage a lot of interactivity. So unfortunately, that's not going to be an option, but I am anticipating that there's probably going to be quite a few questions, particularly about some of the stuff I'm going to be covering at the very end. So I've got a ton of material to cram in, but I'm going to do my best to leave just a little bit of extra time for questions at the end. So by all means, whatever's on your mind, I'd love to hear it. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Now, ransomware is one of those things that is surprisingly tough to define. At one time, we could all agree on what exactly ransomware was. It was something where a user clicks on something they shouldn't have, something gets downloaded to their PC, and lo and behold, the document libraries on their hard drive get encrypted. Well, ransomware is just like anything else in technology. It evolves, it improves, if you want to call that an improvement. It changes. So today's ransomware does a whole lot more than what it used to do with just encrypting document libraries. As a matter of fact, encryption is really just kind of one thing on an entire checklist of items that ransomware can potentially do. For example, at one time, it was unheard of for ransomware to disable an operating system because the ransomware authors had to have the operating system functional to be able to display the ransom demand and to be able to have somebody pay that ransom. Well, today there are forms of ransomware out there that will shut down an operating system if the ransom isn't paid within a certain amount of time. That's just one example. Another thing is ransomware authors are no longer content to just encrypt and lock away the data that they've gotten their hands on. A lot of ransomware now, particularly in the enterprise, is designed to steal that data. So they make copies of the data, they threaten to expose that data to the world, and that can cause any number of problems. Every company out there has things that they would really rather not be made public, even if everything at your organization is on the up and up. And there are big problems that can come from having that data made public, everything from the potential for embarrassment, the loss of a competitive advantage, regulatory fines, the list goes on and on. So the potential for data exposure is definitely something that has to be taken seriously with regard to a discussion on ransomware. So when we talk about ransomware really falls into two main categories, and I'm sure everybody knows this, but just for the benefit of anybody who might be new to this. There is automated ransomware. That's the type that has been around forever, where a user clicks on something that they shouldn't, and something gets downloaded to their machine, and then the ransomware goes about encrypting anything that it can get its hands on. That type of ransomware is largely opportunistic. There's typically not a human directly behind it driving the attack. The other form of ransomware that we run into today is human-operated ransomware. This is much more sophisticated and much more difficult to defend against. The idea behind human-operated ransomware is that an attacker manages to infiltrate the organization in some way, gains access to the network, and then actively plants the ransomware, and then activates it according to when they think the time is right to do so. So these attacks are far more sophisticated than the opportunistic automated ransomware. Now, there is some crossover between the two because there have been instances where someone will click on something they shouldn't and get an automated ransomware infection, but that ransomware does more than just encrypt everything. It also opens up a back door that will then allow an attacker to come in and further the attack through human-operated means. Now, when it comes to the human-operated ransomware attacks that we typically see in the headlines, the really big ones, a lot of those are highly targeted against a specific organization. An attacker will typically spend a lot of time researching that organization, whereas the human-operated variety that I just talked about, where it initially starts with an automated ransomware attack, and then someone steps in and uses the backdoor that was opened by that ransomware to further the attack, those tend to be a lot more opportunistic because they depend on the random chance that the ransomware is going to take hold inside of a corporation somewhere. So when it comes to ransomware, there are a few things to consider. First, as I pointed out, ransomware is no longer content to just encrypt document libraries. It can do a ton of other things. We're talking everything from cyber extortion to identity theft, and the list goes on and on and on about things that can be done with ransomware. Also, modern ransomware isn't content to just damage the PC where the attack was unleashed. Typically, the ransomware is going to try to inflict damage anywhere that it can. At one time, the damage was confined to a user's own local hard drive, but now ransomware will go out on the network. It will try to attack any network shares that it can access. It will attempt to attack SaaS applications and anything else that it can get its hands on. Also, ransomware is known to attack backups. That's something we'll be talking a little bit more about later on, because ransomware authors figured out a long time ago that backups are the number one thing standing between them and the ransom being paid. Because why would an organization pay a ransom if they can just restore a backup to undo the damage? Also, ransomware can and sometimes does attack printers. This is one of those things I never hear anybody talking about, but it is one of those things that's out there. The term that's often used is called print jacking, and there are several different categories of print jacking. One is using a printer, or rather a collection of printers, to launch a denial of service attack. So, in other words, an attacker takes over a printer, and then they use that printer's network connection to launch a denial of service attack against other things. Another form of print jacking is denial of service attacks against the printers themselves. That's fairly self-explanatory. And then the third one is using the printers as a form of electronic eavesdropping, because transmissions to and from printers are rarely encrypted. So if an attacker is trying to gather sensitive information about an organization and what they have going on internally, then they can set up a connection to the printer and monitor all the traffic that's going to the printer. And then when print jobs get submitted, there are actually programs out there that can intercept that print job, convert that into a PDF, and then transmit that to the attacker so that they can see a copy of what it is that's being printed. So those are just a few of the more obscure types of things that ransomware authors can do. The big thing that you need to understand, though, is that ransomware authors are merciless, because these ransomware authors know that the more damage that they can inflict, the better the chance that they're going to get paid, and the bigger demand that they can ask for. One last thing that I want to point out before I move on is that sometimes the damage resulting from a ransomware attack isn't what it seems, because there have been documented instances of attackers bluffing their way toward a payday. And that's something that I'm going to be talking a lot more about later on in this presentation, but it's something that I want you to go ahead and just put it in the back of your mind and be thinking about, because not all ransomware attacks are what they seem to be. So let's get into some of the best practices. The first several best practices that I'm going to be talking about are fairly common, but I went ahead and included them because they're important nonetheless. And then we'll start getting into more of a discussion on human-operated ransomware and on cyber extortion. So the first best practice, don't pay the ransom. Now, I'll be the first to admit that there's a time and a place for everything, and sometimes circumstances may mean that you have absolutely no choice but to pay the ransom. I get that. But if at all possible, I would recommend not paying the ransom. And there are a number of reasons for that. For starters, depending on where you live, paying the ransom could be illegal. So you could land yourself in hot water by paying the ransom. Also, paying the ransom emboldens the attacker, because I caught at the very tail end of the last session, that part of the Q&A, and one of the questions that was asked was, why is it so difficult to shut down all of this ransomware that's happening worldwide? Well, the attackers are going to continue with ransomware attacks for as long as it's profitable. And when you pay a ransom, you're actually emboldening the attacker and encouraging them to do future ransomware attacks. More than that, though, Remember what I said at the very beginning about ransomware evolves over time as technology improves. When you pay a ransom, some of that money that you pay is actually going into the development of future ransomware. So you're funding future ransomware by paying a ransom. Also, when you pay a ransom, the attacker might make a secondary demand. I've actually seen this happen in the real world. Somebody that I used to know got hit by a pretty bad ransomware attack. They decided they were going to go ahead and pay the ransom. So they paid it, and then within minutes, they ended up receiving a secondary demand because the attacker knew that at that point they were financially vested. They weren't going to want to lose the investment they had already made by paying the ransom. So the hacker or the attacker ended up asking for even more money. And this person actually ended up paying a second ransom. Another thing is that paying the ransom doesn't guarantee that you're actually going to get the key to decrypt your data. There are quite a few stories about this on the internet, and I've seen a few real-world examples of this as well. Now, why does that happen? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, when you're dealing with ransomware, you're dealing with a criminal, and criminals can't be trusted, period. But there's actually another reason, and that reason is that, remember what I said at the beginning, there are two types of ransomware, automated and human-operated. I also said that ransomware evolves as technology improves. So consider those 2 points together. Imagine for a moment that an attacker develops a form of automated ransomware. It's not targeting anybody specific. It's just being put out there on the internet, and whoever is unlucky enough to click on it ends up getting infected. Now, let's suppose that a few years go by, and the attacker ends up developing something new and even better in their eyes. So they kind of forget about that very first ransomware that they created, and they move on to something more sophisticated. Now, when that happens, that doesn't mean that that very first piece of ransomware that they created evaporates and is no longer on the internet. It's still out there. So imagine for a moment that somebody ends up coming into contact with that really old piece of ransomware. They click on it, everything gets encrypted. Well, by that point, the attacker has forgotten all about it. They've moved on to something else. So even if the person ends up paying the ransom, the money that they pay is likely going to go into a Bitcoin wallet somewhere, but the attacker has basically forgotten all about that particular piece of ransomware and may not even be in possession of the keys anymore or anything like that. So the ransom payment is essentially going to be ignored, and the victim isn't going to receive the keys to decrypt their data. It's a sad, hard truth, but unfortunately it's something that happens in the real world. So another best practice is to have an air-gapped backup. I can't stress this one enough because remember what I said a moment ago. Backups are the number one defense against ransomware, and the ransomware authors know this. They know that if an organization is able to simply restore a backup, then the ransom won't get paid. So a lot of ransomware attackers have got into the habit of actively attacking backups. The idea being that if they can disable the backup, then they increase the chances that the ransom is going to be paid, because the victim really has no recourse at that point because they don't have a backup that they can restore. This is where an air-gapped backup comes into play. An air-gapped backup is a backup that's created and then completely detached from the system and just put away somewhere safe. Because if it's not connected to anything, then that backup can't be attacked. In my own organization, for example, I have the standard disk-based backup, but a couple of times a week I will copy all of my data to a removable hard drive, unplug that hard drive, and stick it in a safe somewhere so that way, if anything bad happens to my primary backups, I've got that secondary copy. In an enterprise environment, tape is often still used as a way of creating an air-gapped backup because it's really simple to write a backup from your disk-to-disk backup to make a copy to tape, eject that tape, put it someplace safe, and then you've got that secondary backup that can serve as an insurance policy in case something bad happens. It's also important to make sure that you periodically test your backups. Make sure that you are going to be able to use them to recover from a ransomware attack should the need occur. And this one is so important, don't attempt to restore a backup until you're 100% sure that the ransomware is gone. Because if you think you've removed the ransomware and you're wrong, the moment that you insert that backup is put at risk. There's a chance that the backup could end up becoming encrypted at that point or infected or disabled somehow, and then you lose your ability to recover from the attack without paying the ransom. So what else? Well, if you're using Microsoft 365, then I would strongly suggest using Safe Links. Safe Links is a feature that's built into Defender for Office 365. And what it does is it helps to protect your organization against malicious links in things like email messages. And this is in addition to other malware protection that's provided by other elements within the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. So the idea behind Safe Links is really simple. Let's suppose that a user receives a phishing email with a malicious link in it. Well, before that email gets delivered to the user's inbox, Microsoft 365 Defender is going to end up rewriting the URL on that email. So if that user ends up clicking on that, then what's going to happen is instead of going directly to that malicious site, the link is going to take the user to a Microsoft 365 page. That page is then going to figure out what the link was. It's going to compare that link against a list of links that are known to be malicious. And then if that link is found to be malicious, it's going to stop the user from going any further, so that way the act of that user clicking on that link isn't going to do the harm that it otherwise would have. So that's something really simple but effective that you can do to help prevent automated ransomware attacks in the enterprise. Another thing that you can do is to use Microsoft 365 simulated attack training, or attack simulation training, I believe is the actual phrase that Microsoft uses. And I don't want to spend too much time on this one because it's something that I've talked about quite a bit lately in some of my other presentations, but it is effective, so I wanted to at least mention it. The idea is that Microsoft 365 contains tools that you can use to launch a benign phishing attack against your own organization. So the way that this works is that you open a console within Microsoft 365, and it lists several different types of common phishing email messages. For example, you could do a credential harvesting attack in which somebody who's perpetrating a phishing attack attempts to steal a user's username and password. So after you've made that selection, then what happens next is that Microsoft 365 will give you a choice of several different phishing message formats. You pick the one that you like, that you think your users are most likely to fall for, and these do very closely mimic phishing messages that you would see in the real world. And then you choose who you want that message to go to. At that point, the message gets sent out to everybody's email boxes, and you just wait to see what happens. If the user clicks on a link within that message, then because this is benign, nothing bad is going to happen, but instead the user is going to be taken to a site that tells them, hey, you've just fallen for a phishing attack. And then it walks them through several screens that show them how they could have known that this was a phishing attack as opposed to being a legitimate email. And as an option, you can even enroll the user in training so that they'll know what to look for the next time. And interestingly, these simulated phishing attacks aren't a one-shot deal because there's quite a few different options for phishing emails that are available to you. So you can wait a little while after launching the first phishing attack and do a completely different type of phishing attack against your users and find out if they fall for that one or if they've learned from the first time around. So I've provided a link on the slide that points to some more information about these attack simulations, and it's definitely something that I would encourage you to check out if you're not already familiar with it. Another best practice, when it comes to ransomware prevention, permissions are everything. Because when a user ends up clicking on something they shouldn't and invoking a ransomware attack, that attack is going to seek out anything that the user has access to. The flip side of that is that the attack can't touch anything that the user doesn't have access to. So that's a really good argument for using least privilege access. In my mind, a user shouldn't have access to anything that they don't absolutely need in order to do their jobs. And the same thing goes for administrative accounts too. Use role-based access control to limit the scope of administrative duties wherever possible. And give administrators 2 separate accounts or use privileged identity management, whichever you prefer. So that way, an administrator has one set of credentials for anything that actually requires administrative permissions, and they have a completely different set of permissions for the normal day-to-day type work, such as browsing the web or checking email or what have you. Another best practice is to have a recovery plan in place ahead of time. The idea behind this one is to assume that when it comes to ransomware, it's not a matter of if you're going to get hit, but when. Now, I try to use positive thinking in my life, but at the same time, the reality is that most organizations are going to get hit by ransomware at one point or another. And a lot of times, the way to mitigate the damage that's done is to have a plan in place before you ever get hit so that you know what to do next. You're not going to be sitting around like, where do we go from here? So what does this plan look like? Well, it's going to be different for every organization, but at the very least, you need contact information for all of the stakeholders who might be impacted by this. You need to outline your regulatory obligations. If you happen to be in a regulatory or a regulated industry where you're required to disclose this sort of thing, then that's something that everybody needs to know, and that needs to be part of your plan so that you know how to handle that, so that you don't incur additional fines for failing to report it in a timely manner or whatever. Also, outline your preferred recovery method and a second recovery method. Now, this one's a little bit tricky because you don't know exactly what the attack is going to look like, but have an idea, at least at a high level, of what you're going to do to recover from the attack. Also, figure out how you're going to perform forensic analysis of the attack, because regardless of how the attack happened or how much damage it did or didn't do, you need to know, how did that ransomware get in there? What did it touch? And have you gotten rid of it? Has the attack been completely mitigated and cleaned up? Also, one of my really big best practices is to assume that once a system has been compromised by ransomware, it's permanently compromised. Don't even attempt to clean it, just re-image the system, because you can never be 100% sure that you've gotten rid of everything that was put on there by an attacker unless you just re-image the system. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about human-operated ransomware. Human-operated ransomware requires an attacker to be able to remotely issue commands against a victim's network. And a lot of times these commands are going to be based in PowerShell. Now, are they always PowerShell-based? No, absolutely not. There's plenty of other languages that are used. But PowerShell does tend to be used in a lot of these simply because it's so tightly ingrained into the Windows operating system. Because if you think about it, Microsoft provides PowerShell commandlets for just about anything that you could ever possibly want to do to manage Windows, as well as any number of other Microsoft server products. So these same PowerShell commandlets that are used for management can also be used maliciously, and the attackers know that. Additionally, PowerShell can leverage the power of Microsoft.NET. So if there's something that PowerShell is not natively capable of, chances are it can be done through .NET, and you can simply make a .NET call through PowerShell. So let me skip ahead a couple of slides, and I'll show you what this looks like. So here's what a call to a .NET class looks like. So in this example, I'm showing the ability to do math because PowerShell is notoriously bad at math. So the very first line of code that you see here is 2 plus 2, and I get an answer of 4. So PowerShell was able to complete 2 plus 2. But then I tried to do square root of 64, and I got an error message because PowerShell doesn't natively know how to compute a square root. So what I did after that was I did a .NET call to a class called math. And the way that I did that is I put the class name in brackets. You can see the word math in brackets, and then 2 colons, and then the command that I want to perform. So I'm doing square root of 64, and I'm directing that toward .NET. And when I do that, I get an answer of 8. So that's how you would call a .NET class from PowerShell. So let's go back and talk about human-operated ransomware. So if an attack is going to happen, there are 2 things that the attacker is going to need to do. First of all, the attacker is going to need a point of entry into the organization. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a demo here in a minute, and this demo assumes that the attacker has already infiltrated the organization. Now, how do they get in? There's any number of ways that they could get in. Oftentimes, a phishing attack serves as a point of entry because the phishing attack can be used to install a backdoor on a user system, and then the attacker can work from there once they've gained entry. But there are certainly other methods that an attacker can use to gain access. The other thing that has to happen is that the attacker is going to need to be using a privileged account. Now, this is the more difficult of the 2 actions, but there are ways for an attacker to get access to a privileged account. One option is to use a pass-the-hash attack. So the attacker initially attacks a user's machine. They look at the Security Accounts Manager database for the hashes of everyone who's ever signed on to that machine and hope that an admin had signed on at some point. If not, then they move laterally throughout the system, looking at other machines until they eventually find a machine whose security accounts manager contains an account with elevated permissions. Another option is to just purchase a set of credentials off the dark web. There are plenty of people out there selling usernames and passwords. The point being that if an attack is going to succeed, the attacker is going to need a way into the system, and they're going to need elevated credentials. Now, another thing to understand is that getting into the system is really just a first step. And in a sophisticated human-operated ransomware attack, it may be months from the time that the attacker first makes their way into the system to the time that they actively launch an attack against the organization. So why so long? Well, remember, these are very often multi-million-dollar ransom demands that are being made. And the attacker knows that in order for that much money to be paid, then the victim needs to think that the attacker is holding all the cards. So they'll spend this time researching the organization. They figure out what systems are in place, what's positioned where, and they also look for things like who are the key stakeholders in the organization, who works in IT, what procedures are used throughout the organization, what's the normal way of doing things. And I even recently heard a story of an attacker figuring out the intricacies of the organization's data loss prevention insurance policy. So this particular organization got attacked by ransomware, and then during the demands, the ransomware author actually told them, well, I know that you have data insurance for X number of dollars through such and such company. So they had done that much research into the organization before the attack. So again, the attacker's goal here is to spend that time between the making entry into the system and launching the attack to learn everything that they can about the organization to the point that when they do launch the attack, the victims think that the attacker is holding all the cards because they've thoroughly done their homework and they know everything there is to know about the organization. So what happens when the attacker actually launches the attack? Well, it can vary quite a bit because, again, every organization is different and every attack is different. But a lot of times, one of the first things that an attacker will do is they'll start downloading things in order to make the attack a little bit easier. So one of the early signs that an attack is imminent is discovering the presence of hacking tools on your network that shouldn't be there. Now, remember when I said that a lot of times these attacks are carried out through PowerShell? In PowerShell, there are a number of different ways that you can force a download of external tools. There's the invoke web request command. There's the new object system new or net.web.client command. There's the start bits transfer command. I don't want to go into these commands in detail just in the interest of time because I've still got a lot of I'm trying to cover. But any one of these commands that you see at the bottom of the slide can be used to initiate a download from an external web server. So how else might an attacker operate? Well, one of the goals is to evade detection until the attack is complete and the ransom demand is made. So a lot of times an attacker will do this through fileless malware. In other words, they're performing activities that behave a lot like malware, but they don't actually use files because malware files can get detected by anti-malware software. So there are several different techniques that a malware author might use to avoid using files until the very last minute so that those files evade detection. So here's an example. One trick that is sometimes used in the real world is to create malicious files dynamically. Now in this case, I've compiled a series of commands into a script, but in the real world, these probably wouldn't be launched as a script. They'd probably be run manually, typically using copy-paste. Another thing that I've done in the script is on the third line, it says $text, which is a variable declaration equals write host hello world. Now, in programming class, the very first program that most programming students learn to write is just a simple program that displays the words hello world on the screen. In this case, I'm using a command to display the words hello world in place of malicious instructions because I really don't want to turn this into a class on how to write malware. So just assume from here throughout the rest of the presentation that anytime you see hello world, that's a stand-in for a malicious instruction. So what have we got here? Well, the very first thing that we have is new item path, C:/files, item type directory. So that very first command ends up creating a folder on the victim's machine called files, or C:/files. Then the next command creates a new item. This time the item type is set to file, so it's creating an empty file. And that file is called C:/files, so we're putting the file in the folder that we created a moment ago, and we're calling that file eviltrojan.txt. And again, we could call this anything that we want, but I'm just using this for illustrative purposes. Then we're creating a variable called $text, and we're setting that variable equal to write host hello world. So in other words, we're creating a variable that contains text, but that text is actually a malicious command. So then we're taking the contents of the $text variable, and we're outputting that to the file that we just created, the C:/file/eviltrojan.txt file. So at this point, the Windows is totally unaware that anything malicious is happening. Yes, we've got some malicious instructions, but we're handling that as raw text. It wouldn't be any different than if you were to type a PowerShell command into Microsoft Word or something like that. So then the second to the last command, rename item, that changes the file name. So we're changing the file extension from .text to .ps1. So now we have a PowerShell file that we've created on the fly. And then the very last command, invoke expression C:/file/eviltrojan.ps1, actually causes that file that we've dynamically created on the fly to execute. So that's a really probably oversimplified example of how an attacker can dynamically create a malicious script on the fly and evade detection in the process. So what else can be done? Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, a lot of the malware attacks are fileless. And the most important thing to understand about fileless malware attacks is that in most of those, the code doesn't even run on the victim's machine. Instead, the attacker runs all the code on their own machine and just transmits individual commands to the victim's machine. So that's one way that the attacker can help to evade detection. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Now, sending a remote command to a victim's machine, that's easy. The vast majority of the PowerShell commands out there support the computer name parameter. So you can direct it at a specific IP address or a specific computer name as long as it's DNS resolvable. And if a command doesn't support that, no problem. You can use invoke command along with the computer name parameter and the script block parameter. So what that does is anything that's in the script block, no matter how long it is, no matter if the commands support remote execution or not, anything in that script block can be sent to the remote machine that's specified through the computer name parameter. Now the tricky part is being able to act on the information that's returned, because anything that you execute actually executes on the remote machine, not on your local machine. So if you were to declare a variable within the script block, that variable would only exist on the remote machine. It wouldn't exist on the attacker's machine. So the way that an attacker gets around this is by mapping the invoke command commandlet to a variable, just as I've done here. See, I've got $explorer equals invoke command dash computer name demo DC dash script block, and then I've got contents that are to be sent to the remote machine. But because I've mapped that to a variable, that gives me the ability to act on the output locally, because that's going to be a local variable that exists on the attacker's machine in this case. So I can begin to pull information out of that variable and do with it as I will. So how does all of this really work? Well, remember a moment ago I showed you a few different PowerShell commandlets that you could use to force a download from a remote system. So with that in mind, take a look at the diagram on the right side of the slide. We have an attacker system, and we have a victim system, and then we have a malicious web server. So the attacker is sending instructions to the victim system, instructing that system to download malicious code from that malicious web server. That's a really high-level example of how a fileless malware attack works. So what does this look like in practice? Well, let me show you. So the next few slides are borrowed from a in-person presentation that I did at the Experts Conference a few years ago. I would have loved to have simply provided a link to that, but to the best that I can tell, it isn't posted online anywhere. So what we have here is an IIS server, which comes with Windows. And you'll notice that the File Explorer window is pointed to C:/inetpub www root. That's the default folder that Internet Information Server, or IIS as it's often called, uses to store files that are used for hosting. So everything in this folder is accessible over the Internet. So we have an HTML file and a PNG file that are created by default by Windows at the time that you install the IIS service. And then we've got a file that I created called eviltrojan.exe. And I've put this in the www root folder so that it can be downloaded from this web server. So this is going to be my malicious web server. Then we've got the attacker script. And remember, this runs on the attacker's system. So the first command is invoke command computer name demodc-script block. So what I'm doing is I'm invoking a command, but I'm running this command against the domain controller on the victim system. So the first command within the script block is a new item command. So I'm creating a folder. In this case, that folder is going to be called c:/files. Then the next command is invoke web request -URI, and then I'm pointing it to the URL of the web server. And then I'm specifying /eviltrojan.exe. So I'm downloading the eviltrojan.exe file from that web server. Now you'll notice that this command ends with out file. And what that out file does is it renames the eviltrojan.exe file to something that's a little more likely to evade detection. In this case, I'm just calling it explorer.exe since that's the name of one of the files used by the Windows operating system. So I'm using a bit of obfuscation here. Then the very last command is invoke expression, and I'm calling cmd.exe, that's the Windows command prompt, and I'm telling the command prompt to run explorer.exe, which is actually my evil Trojan file. And this causes that malicious file to execute. So with these few lines of code, I'm able to remotely instruct the victim's machine to go and download something malicious, download themselves, rename that file, and then execute it, all on the victim's machine. And I did all of that without ever actually normal malware on there. So here you see a view of the victim's machine, and you can see the explorer.exe file that was downloaded. Now, when it comes to these fileless malware attacks, one of the best practices is don't rely on execution policies to protect you. Now, execution policies, for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's a mechanism that's built into PowerShell that prevents scripts from running in certain situations. And execution policies primarily exist to prevent administrators from accidentally running something that they didn't mean to. It's not going to stop a determined attacker. Yes, it might slow an attacker down a little bit, but there are quite a few different ways that you can circumvent an execution policy. So don't rely on that 100% and assume that just because you've got an execution policy set to restricted that there's no way that somebody can run malicious PowerShell code on your system. Also, another best practice is don't disable Microsoft Defender, because Microsoft Defender actually looks at PowerShell and it can detect certain types of malicious activity. You can see an example of a message that I got from PowerShell when I tried to run a malicious script. And incidentally, that malicious script was something that I wrote. It wasn't something that I accidentally downloaded. Another best practice is to use group policy settings to create a PowerShell transcript. So that way, if PowerShell commandlets are entered, you've got a record of it that's locked away in this log. So I want to wrap up the presentation by talking a little bit about cyber extortion. And we're starting to run a little tight on time, but I think I can fit all of this in. Because cyber extortion is one of the really big trends that's gained hold in ransomware. These days, ransomware authors aren't content to simply encrypt your data. A lot of times they'll try to sell that data or try to embarrass you with it, or threaten to expose it to the public or to the media or something like that. So it's really important to know how to deal with cyber extortion when it happens. So the first thing that I want to mention about cyber extortion is that it's important to know what it is that you're really up against. I mentioned this toward the beginning of the presentation and said that it's something you should keep in the back of your mind. This is why. When a cyber extortion attack occurs, the attacker may be bluffing. A lot of times the attack might not be what it seems. So it's extremely important that if you receive a cyber extortion demand, that you take the time to verify what the cyber criminal actually has and what they're truly capable of. So how does cyber extortion work? Well, just like any other ransomware attack, with the exception of hacktivist attacks, that's something totally different. That's a little beyond the scope of this presentation, but the attacker's goal is to get paid, plain and simple. And if the attacker wants to get paid, there's a couple of things that they have to do. First of all, they have to get the victim of the attack to respond with emotion, not logic. They don't want the victim to take the time to think things through and to come up with a rational response. Instead, they want them to act on emotion, because people who act on emotion will typically make mistakes, and the attackers are counting on this. The other thing is the attacker has to threaten consequences that are completely unacceptable to the victim. So what does that mean? Well, it means that whatever it is that the attacker is threatening, it has to be something that the victim just cannot have happen, period, full stop. So what are some consequences that are acceptable versus unacceptable? Well, let me give you an example. A few years ago, or actually I guess it's been more than a few years now, it's quite a ways back, I had somebody try to pull one of these stunts on me, but they hadn't actually done their homework or anything. I think it was a blind phishing attack. And they sent me this mail posing as a particular bank, and they said that if I didn't take a particular action, that they were going to close my account. Well, the only account that I had with that particular bank at that time was a car lease, so I was like, yes, please close that account. So that was an example of an acceptable consequence. An unacceptable consequence might be taking your organization's deepest, dirtiest secrets and handing it over to the media or something like that. So the attacker has to come up with something that they can threaten you with that's going to force your hand and make you take action, where you just won't have any choice but to take action. So the big philosophy that cyber extortionists often operate under is something that might be best paraphrased by a line from one of my favorite movies, Sergeant Bilko. There was a guy in the movie that said, we don't actually have to be holding 4 aces as long as they think we're holding 4 aces. The idea being that the attacker doesn't actually have to have all the cards as long as you think they do. They can bluff their way into a payday, and that's what a lot of cyber extortion is counting on. So imagine for a moment that a cyber extortionist contacts a victim and they claim to have some incriminating photos, whatever those photos may happen to be. Typically, they're not going to keep the message short and sweet and say, pay up or I'll release these photos, because that's too easy. Remember what I said a moment ago about the attacker will try to get the victim to respond with emotion rather than logic. So they're going to try to ratchet up the emotional response. Instead of saying pay up or I'll release the photos, they'll give you something like, if you don't pay up, I'll release these photos and they're going to ruin your life. Your wife's going to leave you. You're going to be fired from your job, and your whole life's going to fall apart. Something like that. They're going to try to elicit an emotional response. They're going to paint a picture of a worst-case scenario just to get you to think, oh my goodness, I don't want that to happen. I'm going to pay the ransom demand. So people tend to make mistakes in judgment when they're stressed, and the attackers know this. They're counting on this. So besides the emotional aspect of it, the attacker is usually also going to make a demand in terms of time. So they're going to try to turn the screws a little by putting time constraints on the offer, saying something like, if I don't get my money by tomorrow or by next week or whatever it is, then I'm going to ruin your life. So by doing that, they're not giving the victim a chance to really think things through. They're forcing the victim to react a lot more quickly than they might prefer to. So if something like this happens, what are some key considerations before you decide on a course of action? Well, first of all, you have to consider, is the threat actually credible? A lot of them aren't, and a lot of people don't realize that. So you have to truly assess the threat and figure out, is it credible or is it not credible? And the way that you do that is by looking at, has the attacker presented even one shred of evidence that they've actually got what they say that they have? A few years ago, I was traveling, and typically whenever I take time off, I make it a point to go somewhere where I'm completely inaccessible because, it's hard to relax when you're checking email and your phone's ringing off the hook and all that. So I think I was hiking in the rainforest or something like that at the time, somewhere way off the grid where nobody could reach me. So I got back to the States, went through customs at the airport, and then I turned my phone on. And within a couple minutes, my phone starts ringing. And it's a friend of mine. And he's like, oh, thank goodness you answered. I've been trying to reach you for days. I'm like, okay, well, what's up? And then he's like, hey, do you know anything about Bitcoin? It seemed a little weird that he was asking me about Bitcoin when he just told me he'd been trying to reach me for days. But I figured maybe he's got an investment opportunity. So I told him, sure, I know a little bit about Bitcoin. What do you need? Then he changed the subject on me. And he says, hey, tell me about hackers. Is it true that they can take over your webcam? So I kind of started putting two and two together, and he told me he's been trying to reach me urgently. He's asking me about Bitcoin, and now he's asking me about hackers. So I'm like, did you get hit by ransomware? And his response was, I wish. Now, nobody wishes that they got hit by ransomware, so I'm thinking, whatever is going on, it's got to be awful. So he goes on to tell me that he has been hit by a cyber extortion scam that claims to have all of this stuff on him. And so I started asking him some questions, and one of the questions is, have they provided any evidence that any of this is real? Well, it turns out they hadn't. One of the signs of a true attack is that they're going to want to flex a little muscle. Remember, they're going to want to scare you into paying the ransom demand. So in my friend's case, had this been real, then I would have expected them to share one of the photos that they had or something like that, just as a way of flexing a little muscle and making him think, oh my goodness, this is real. They're going to release this. This is awful. I better pay the demand. But they didn't provide anything like that. The whole thing was a hoax. They didn't have anything on my friend. Another thing is, if the attacker actually has provided evidence, is the evidence real? Does it actually point to anything having happened? Now, that sounds weird, but there was somebody else that I know who, a while back, got in touch with me, and they said, oh my goodness, I've been hacked. I don't know what to do. And I asked them, why do you think you've been hacked? And they told me they got this email from an attacker, and they said, I know that your password is whatever it was. And so I asked them, is that really your password? And even as I was asking that question, I'm thinking, that's a really dumb question. They wouldn't be calling me if that wasn't their password. So I don't even know why I asked that question, to be honest with you. But then they stopped and thought about it, and they're like, well, yeah, it was my password about 3 years ago, but I used something different today. So this person that launched the attack had apparently gone out to one of the password databases on the dark web, harvested a bunch of passwords, and sent out emails to who knows how many people saying, hey, I know your password is such and such. And they were counting on the idea that there would be a certain number of people who hadn't changed their password in years and years and would assume that they had been compromised based on that email. So in considering if the threat is credible, another thing to consider, and this is kind of an unpleasant thought, but how bad would the attack be if the attacker followed through with the threat? It's one of those things nobody likes to think about, but it's an important part of assessing the situation. So let's say that the attacker has everything that they claim to have. What is the absolute worst that could come of it? Is it the type of thing that would blow over in a few weeks, or is it one of those things that would absolutely ruin your life forever? That's an important thing that you have to consider. Another consideration is, can the attacker actually do what they're threatening to do? In other words, if they do have pictures, do they actually have access to your social media accounts where they could post those pictures and expose you? Do they have access to your contacts? Things like that. That's actually a really important consideration. I had somebody contact me a while back, probably one of these phishing scams that targets about 1 million people, and they said that they were going to post something on my Facebook account. Well, I knew that one was wrong because I deleted my Facebook account years ago, so I told them, go ahead. Never heard anything else about it. Also, it's a little bit off topic, but the whole account takeover thing, it's one of those things that's existed for a lot longer than social media. Because, as we all know, it's really easy to spoof an email address and to spoof somebody's name through email, make it look like you're sending an email as another person. Phishing operators do that all the time. I actually had somebody, maybe about 20 years ago, that spoofed my email address and fired off a letter to one of my editors posing as me, saying all kinds of nasty things. Unfortunately, that editor knew my writing style well enough and knew me well enough to know that that wasn't me, but it was still a little unnerving. So there are ways of doing that. It's a little off topic, just thought I'd throw that out there. Finally, is there anything that you can do that would entice the attacker to cut their losses and move on to another target? Because an attacker knows with each move that they make, their risk of getting caught becomes greater and greater. So they're going to want to minimize the number of moves and minimize the amount of time that they're invested in this particular scam because they want to get paid and move on. So anything that you can do to drag things out or to make them nervous and think that they might get caught, that's only going to help you. So it's just a few things that I wanted to talk about cyber extortion. And I actually talked a little longer than I had planned. I wanted to leave a bit more time than that for questions, but let's go ahead and take those questions now.
hi, Brian. I think that John may be having a bit of tech issues, so we're going to give him a second to figure that out. But I'm here for the Q&A, so let's jump in. All right, so the first question I see here is, do you think we will ever get to the point where ransomware will be a thing of the past?
There are a lot of different philosophies on that. I'm going to lean toward no, at least not in the near term. Because the thing that comes to mind is that there was a time quite a few years back when people were saying that spam would eventually become a thing of the past because AI was getting to the point where it could recognize spam and just get rid of it before it ever lands in your inbox. And yet, even all these years later, we all still get spam every single day. So in spite of billions of dollars being invested in that and all of the research and development effort, the problem never really went away. Spam keeps evolving. And I think the same thing is going to happen with ransomware. I think that great progress has been made, but that the ransomware authors are also investing a lot in development. And for the foreseeable future, ransomware is going to remain a threat.
That's unfortunate, but honest. Thank you. We have another one here that says, what are the best things to test when you test your backups?
What are the best things to test when you test your backups? One of the biggest mistakes that people make with backup testing is to just do a restoration and not really look at anything beyond that. Like, okay, did the backup restore? Great, we're all done. Beyond that, I would say test to make sure that everything actually works once it's been restored. Restored to a lab environment. Make sure that any critical services come online. Make sure that your applications are functioning as intended, that they're not missing any dependencies that didn't get restored. And take a moment and check the integrity of the data that's been restored. Take the time to open up your applications, look at the data that's in there, and make sure it looks the way that it's supposed to. Those are some of the more important things that I would focus on.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. I want to squeeze this one in. How would an attacker first gain access to a system for the fileless malware attack?
There are so many ways that an attacker can get in to do that. In the past, what they would often do is look for an exploitable vulnerability, something that was a widely known vulnerability in an operating system or in an application that the organization used, and then focus on that. That's starting to become used less often these days because software companies have become so good about issuing security patches that a lot of times those vulnerabilities aren't around for very long. And the attackers know that if they invest all this effort into figuring out how to exploit a vulnerability, their efforts aren't going to be valid for very long. So oftentimes what they'll do is they'll try to either get in contact with the organization's help desk and, hey, can you reset a password? And all of a sudden they've got credentials they can use to get in and begin their attack from there. Or they'll do something like send a phishing email message to employees of this organization hoping that somebody clicks on a link and downloads something that can act as a backdoor. There's a lot of different ways that they can get in.
Thank you, Brian, and that seems to be all the time we have for Q&A. We luckily got John back on the line, so I'm going to pass it back to you now.
Hey.
John?
Hey, John.
Sorry about that, guys. I lost my connection. That was an awesome session, Brian, as always. Very scary and and very informative. I want to thank you for that, and I also want to thank our sponsors, Chaosoft, Ignite, Metallic, and Zoho for making this session possible. We are going to take a short break right now, but we'll be back at the top of the hour for our third session, Hottest Third-Party Solutions, which will be moderated by Becky Nagel, Vice President of Web at 1105 Media. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console